Hi, I'm Greg Giusti, retired forest advisor with the University of California here in Mendocino and Lake counties, and also a proud founding member of the Redwood Forest Foundation. Just retired after 33 years with the university. All of my university time was spent on the North Coast and within the Redwood region. Started in 1985 with UC in Del Norte County, where I was a jack of all trades. And when I was able to come down here, the reason I came down here is it gave me an opportunity to be more focused on my professional discipline, which is being an ecologist, both terrestrial and aquatic systems. At one point in my life, I worked for 2 years on a research vessel offshore out around the Farallones and in San Francisco Bay. So I'm comfortable in both aquatic and terrestrial environments. I've always had an interest in just learning. Even today, I still enjoy learning and understanding relationships between organisms and their environment. And when I say organisms, that includes people, to understand the relationship that people have with their environment. I'm also a registered professional forester, though I never went to forestry school per se. I learned my trade by apprenticing with a colleague at UC Berkeley, and passed the test in 1993 and have been an RPF ever since. So my interest is in understanding how the world works and how people interact with those workings, and how people can influence those workings, good and bad, but always trying to stay on the positive for the betterment of our environment and our communities. As I said, I was born and raised in California, and always lived on the peninsula. I had San Francisco Bay as my backdrop, and San Bruno Mountain as my backyard. I always just enjoyed being out. I always enjoyed absorbing my natural world around me. I've always had a basic curiosity of why things do what they do. So it was a natural progression for me to go to San Francisco State. I did my undergraduate and graduate work there. And I just tried to absorb as much as I could. I studied invertebrates, vertebrates, plants, plant communities, did my graduate work on field mice in Oak Woodlands, Jasper Ridge on the Stanford property. And my first job was actually working on a research vessel on San Francisco Bay and offshore out around the Farallones. And while I was there, I was actually invited to teach a class at Stanford for 2 years. It was called the SWAPC, Social Workshops on Politics and the Environment, or something like that. It was just a seminar class. We taught it at night, and had a wonderful experience teaching that class on campus for 2 years. So I've just always enjoyed interacting with people. I've always enjoyed interacting with the natural world. So, and then after working on the boat, I got a job with the County of Mendocino Department of Agriculture, where I did a lot of pesticide regulations, a lot of plant inspections, got exposed to the politics of plants, if you will. And then when the opportunity came to take a job with UC at Del Norte County, I was fortunate enough to apply and get that job. Stayed up there for about 5 years, and then, as I said, came down here in 1989, 1990, and began my career here, and just been here ever since. Over the course of 33 years working with UC, it was quite a ride. I was fortunate enough to be invited to be part of the integrated hardwood range management program at UC Berkeley for 20 years, where essentially everything we know about California oaks came out of that project, came out of that program, and worked with fellow ecologists, wildlifers, foresters, and really immersed myself in understanding the oaks of California, which is a forest type, an extensive forest type of 77 million acres, and one that is under constant threat of development and conversion. But also, while I was up here, I studied interactions of black bears feeding on second growth redwoods. I studied the structure of old growth redwood forests and published some of the first quantified work on just what an old growth forest, how it's built, what are the parts. Consequently, was able to do a lot of small mammal work in old growth forests and publish some of the limited information we have on redback voles in California. So I've just, I've always worked in treed environments for the most part, at least over here in Mendocino County, and also was able to be on the forefront of unlocking a lot of the secrets of not only old growth redwood forest, but also the ecology and structure of California's oak woodlands. The other half of my life over in Lake County, I spent 25, 30 years trying to understand Clear Lake, the largest natural lake within the borders of California. And I continue to do that today. I'm still working on projects over on that side of the hill. So as I said before, I've always been interested in interactions of organisms and their environment, and I've tried not to limit myself to just one particular focus. I think for the betterment of myself and for the betterment of California, I think I'm better at, I'm a better professional, I'm a better academic of having a broad understanding of a lot of subjects. And then obviously if I need to get into the weeds on a particular area, there are those who take a very focused approach to their profession, and I tap into them when I need to. It was, so, if we go back to 1989, 1990, 1991, Redwood Summer, Big Green Initiative, Forest Forever initiatives, banners across the Golden Gate Bridge, Judy Berry and Daryl Cherney getting blown up in Berkeley. It was horrible. Maxam, Maxam and Palco. It was a horrible time. It was a dark time. And the communities, these communities on the North Coast, the fabric of those communities was being torn apart. Much like the politics we see today in the United States and the divisiveness that's going on here, it was the same kind of divisiveness going on back then, but in a much smaller microcosm of communities. And I think there was a number of us who simply thought that was not a path forward that was going to be for the benefit of individuals or for communities. And when Louisiana Pacific announced that they were going to liquidate their properties in California, a number of us who had been on both, not necessarily both sides of the timber wars, but had different roles during that time, thought, there's got to be a better way. This was not producing anything of quality. We knew that resources were being exploited to a point of negativity. We knew that forests were being depleted of their resources. We knew that jobs were short-lived because the forest could not sustain the level of harvest that was going on. And so I think a lot of us, because of the time, just realized maybe there's a different way. Didn't know what the way was at the time, but we're willing to explore different possibilities. The county of Mendocino was exploring its own county rules, which today, in hindsight, what was being proposed, limiting harvest to 2% of inventory, it was so simplistic, it was brilliant. And to this day, I still think that approach has merit. But nonetheless, that just added to the controversy. And it was actually at this house where a group of us, people that you've interviewed for this project, came together in your living room, and the idea of RFFI was not only born, but it was codified. We agreed to move forward and to try and see if we can develop a structure that could somehow acquire timberland, manage it on a local basis, try and get the management decisions out of Portland, out of Atlanta, Georgia, LP and GP, that was their home base, and see if we couldn't wrestle control of some of these timberlands for the betterment of the community and to restore the ecological functionality of these systems. So, when we launched the idea, I remember being in a public meeting and being accused of promoting creeping socialism. Another person claimed that we were nothing but a bunch of wild-eyed elitists, and who were we to think that we could manage timberland? again, there was just so much hostility in the air at the time. You just knew you were going to be catching darts. But at the same time, Louisiana Pacific opened up their books and said, "Yeah, you know, we know you don't have any money, but we like your idea. We were working with Joe Ufrat and Tom Tuckman at the time, trying to use municipal bonds to buy forest land, and they said they were intrigued. You know, I mean, corporate America was intrigued by that. They didn't care where the money came from. They just wanted the money, and we just wanted money that was cheap. So you know, they opened up their books. We had full access to their inventories, and we were able to play with those numbers. And even though we weren't successful, we learned so much of how to move forward. And what we realized we had to move forward, we needed to get a change in the tax code so that nonprofit organizations could own and manage timberland. And we did it. We got a change in the tax code. So the 120,000 acres that are currently under nonprofit ownership in Mendocino County are the direct result of RFFI's efforts. It wouldn't have happened without us. And even though we got very close to getting an act of Congress to change, to allow municipal bonds to be used for purchase, politics being politics, it just fell short. But we actually had a bill introduced into the House and into the Senate. We had bipartisan support, and things were moving really well. And 2008 came along, and it just, I mean, there was a lot of downturns in the economy. A lot of things happened. But nonetheless, you know, what the original founders of RFFI, we were risk takers. We had a vision, but we knew we'd have to put ourselves out there. We knew we'd have to buck the status quo. We knew that there was a contingent here locally that was frightened of the model we were presenting, and we knew when we went out in the public we were going to be catching javelins. But we also knew it was worth it. And you know, all of us have thick-skinned. All of us were in the public eye for years. We knew what was coming. It didn't matter. The prize was big enough that a few bruises along the way was worth it. Well, so again, you know, when we met in your living room in 1997, it wasn't a group of strangers. It was a group of people that have known each other for a number of years. As I said, perhaps we're on different sides of a debate at the time, but we're respectful of one another. And I think at that time, all of us realized that the old model simply wasn't working. When the Mendocino rules package came up, you know, there was in 1989, Mendocino County harvested 515 million board feet of timber. But to give you a comparison, in 2018, the county harvested 125 million. So, I mean, it just gives you an example of just how aggressive the companies were at the end of the 80s. You know, that was a time when Harry Merlo for Louisiana Pacific said, we will log to infinity and beyond. There was just a mindset that these resources were limitless. And not only the inventories were being driven down, but the quality of the wood was being driven down. I mean, you were seeing logging trucks that were taking logs that were half sapwood. It wasn't redwood, it was white redwood. And so there's absolutely no economic value there. So, you know, unfortunately, these corporate structures were treating redwood as a commodity. You know, like ponderosa pine or Douglas fir, and yet here's a species of tree that only grows in California on 2.2 million acres, and yet it wasn't given the recognition that it was due. I mean, redwood has so many wonderful qualities, right? It's disease resistant, it's insect resistant, it's durable, if it's red. And they were selling garbage, and it was not only hurting the market, but it was hurting local jobs. People weren't buying anymore, and things like Trex and these other composites were coming on the market because redwood wasn't living up to its value. So, I mean, I think from all of us that met in your room, in your house, we're looking at all of these different components that not only were the inventories being driven down, but the value of the product was being drowned, the markets were being lost, people, jobs were being lost. It was a mess, and it just seemed like nobody cared. The absentee corporate owners just didn't care. They were just bleeding this county dry. So when I think we all walked into the room with that mindset, and we're open to exploring a new normal, a new reality, and it clicked. I mean, that's all I can say. It clicked. I think all of us walked out of your house that day, knowing that we were trying to be on a new path. We didn't know where that path was going to go, but we were all open to keeping the door open and following our hearts, really. So at the time, concurrent with our own discussions, I mean, my own career was taking me in a direction of trying to figure out how do we bring people together? How do we cross these ideological boundaries that were so entrenched and people were so passionate about? And so I actually developed a model that illustrated and visualized how you actually identify a problem, set goals, who has to be part of the solution, and so I started giving lectures on that model throughout the state. I actually shared it with the Board of Supervisors here, and shared it with the Mendocino Forest Council, and just trying to get the idea out that, okay, you can have different points of view, but through respect, you can hear each other's point of view and debate those point of view, not fight about them, but debate them. And that's really where the basis of RFFI, the foundation of RFFI, the strength of RFFI was, even though a whole different group of people came together and we had very different views, we always respected each other's point of view. And it's that foundation that held RFFI together. I mean, we had some intense debates, right? But again, they were respectful of one another. We appreciated where people were coming from, and we knew that diversity of perspective was giving us strength in the end. Just a side note, that model that I ended up lecturing on actually ended up getting published in a book about biodiversity protection in Costa Rica. Working with a professor at Berkeley. He loved the model so much, he was writing this book on Costa Rica, and it ended up getting published there. So I kind of chuckle about that. But also at the same time, espousing this view of, okay, these are community forests. The community has to be involved. The community's working in the forest. Jobs are dependent on it. Both lumber jobs and ocean jobs. I mean, I was very strong saying, salmon are a forest product. Foresters often just think of wood as a forest product. No, there's lots of forest products. There's mushrooms, there's salmon, there's steelhead, and there are economies based on, and people's lives based on these other forest products. So, and even in my own realm of academia, bumping heads with some old school forest professors on Berkeley campus that just, really thought I was nuts. That what do you mean fish are a forest product? They're, maybe they're there, but they're not really a product. Well, that's not the way you should look at the world. Or if you live in Mendocino or Humboldt counties or even Sonoma counties, they are definitely a forest product. No forest, no fish. So again, bringing out a lot of these new ideas and challenging a lot of these old paradigms was really where I was at that time. And for me, the idea of RFFI coming together and challenging the paradigm of corporate ownership, absentee ownership, was just a natural progression of where I was at that point in my life and in my profession. You get 12 or 13 passionate people in a room. Some people are splitters, looking at every word. Some people are more lumpers, like, that's good enough, let's move forward. And so just how we approach problem solving, it's a challenge. And it's management by committee. It's like democracy. It's going to be sloppy. It's going to be messy. You just have to stay with it. You're going to be frustrated, but you stay focused on moving the process forward, trying at the end of the day to say, okay, we got something done. And yet that tedium can be exhausting at times. But again, we were trying to change the world at that time. We were trying to change the IRS tax code. We were trying to get a congressional act that would allow the use of monies that were not available. We were working with lawyers to get nonprofits recognized to manage timberland. We were developing bylaws. We were evaluating inventories from Louisiana Pacific, a couple 100,000 acres worth of timberland. I mean, there was a lot going on, and it wasn't, you know, sure, you had those discussions, but those discussions were in the context of all these other pressures, all these other stresses, all these other desires by a group of very different people, but all trying to get to the same end goal, which was a new model of forest ownership and management that hadn't been done before. So yeah, there was a lot of angst, there was a lot of anxiety, there was a lot of excitement, there was frustration. You know, there's every human emotion you can imagine once a month at Arts with a lunch. Yeah, my approach to the job was always seek forgiveness rather than permission. And I never thought I needed permission from the University of California to do the job as I saw I needed to do it. And it never harmed me. I mean, I had no problem advancing through the merit and promotion system of the University of California. And when I retired, I was as high as I could go at full title. So I was always one to not worry about how I was going to do my job. If I thought that I was advancing and advancing a topic while maintaining my objectivity, I felt that I was within the realm of what I was being paid to do by the people of California, and apparently others believe that too. But yeah, and many times I was asked, because of the role I played and because of the way I approached my position, I was often asked to moderate a number of contentious activities, whether it was the North Coast Bioregional Biodiversity Council, or the Mendocino Forest Council. If I was asked to take on that role, I felt if I believed I had something to offer and I could move that project forward, I accepted the role. And the Mendocino Forest Council was during a time after the State Board of Forestry denied Mendocino County its county rules, which I don't really think they legally could have done. If you read the rules, it says that the board shall adopt county rules if passed by the Board of Supervisors. But again, it was during a time when there was tremendous political pressures and monies being forced on the Board of Forestry, water under the bridge. But nonetheless, the county continued to want to play a role in managing how timber was being managed, and so the Forest Council was the official word, if you will, of Mendocino County, interjecting its voice into timber harvest plans and other subjects related to timber management in the county. The council was a standing committee of the Board of Forestry, and we reported regularly to the board. The first land was Louisiana Pacific. When they announced, I mean, that was the catalyst. Louisiana Pacific's announcement that they were putting their California properties up for sale was the catalyst that started the RFFI process. They had some property, I think it's called Willow Creek down in Sonoma County, which they also put up. But we were trying to. Our approach to Louisiana Pacific is we want it all. We were nuts, but I mean that meant the mill, that meant the distribution center, that meant everything. You know, it's like, hey, we got nothing to lose. We didn't have a dime in the bank. Okay. And they said, okay, we'll talk to you. That was the crazy part. It's like, okay, let's talk. But again, I think all of us took the attitude, it's like, we got nothing to lose. But if you don't try, you don't get. And all of us were in the mindset, let's try. So again, even though we weren't successful at that, it served as the driver to get all of the other things in place, all our ducks in a row, so that when a property came up, we'd be more prepared. And a couple of years later, Georgia Pacific came up, and we were more prepared. And again, we got invited to the table. We were given the sale documents. we were in a better position. We had all our legal requirements in order. But, you know, money talks. And when the Washington retirement system came in and laid cash on the table, Georgia Pacific took that sale, which I don't blame them. I mean, it was, you know, again, we had a great idea and they loved the idea, but we still didn't have a lot of money in the bank. We might have had $1,000. But anyway, so Hawthorne came in and RFFI just continued on. We continued looking at properties, and eventually Hawthorne decided to sell that Usal tract. This was about 2007, I think. And the Bank of America happened to, you know, again, I'm getting back to, I want to go back and visit the accusation of promoting creeping socialism. We got in bed with Bank of America. Bank of America is a lot of things, but I don't think of them as socialists. So nonetheless, they had a president at the time that was open-minded, and he wanted to invest a lot of money, billions of dollars, in environmental causes, and it clicked. He was there, we were there, and they agreed to give us the money. They didn't give us a deal. I mean, I'm still a little tweaked. I wish they had given us a little better break on the interest, but nonetheless, they wanted to partner with us. They recognized the value of getting together with a new idea, a nonprofit timber owner, and they were willing to play ball with us. B of A, Bank of America, was interested in collaborating with RFFI. Again, it always comes down to who's present at a particular time, and the bank had a president who was very interested in this. Nothing lasts forever, and bank presidents come and go, and so it was all about timing and having that individual in that role at that time, and us being prepared because of all of the work we had done. You know, we started in '97. This was 2007. We'd put 10 years of monthly meetings in, and so we were ready, and we came across as being ready, and people like Tom Tuckman and Joe Ufrat spoke that language, that corporate money language. And we presented an image that, yeah, we can handle this. And he believed us. And so they loaned us the money. And we were able to make actually Hawthorne had come to us. So we weren't in a competitive situation. It was a one-on-one discussion. They gave us a price. We were able to come up with the money, and we closed the deal. And then the work started. Again, up to that point, it was just talk, and talk is cheap. But once we acquired that 50,000 acres, things got real quick. I think Hawthorne approached RFFI for a couple of reasons. I think they knew about us. I think they had a piece of property that really wasn't going to make them money for a long time, because Georgia Pacific had extracted a lot of volume out of Usal. Even though it's good growing ground, it was aggressively harvested, and so I think it made sense for a pension fund to get rid of what they saw as probably going to be a liability and take their money and be happy with it and turn it over, which we knew from the beginning. Those of us that formed RFFI knew from the beginning we weren't going to get a crown jewel. If we bought anything, it was going to be a piece of ground that had been whacked pretty hard. And Usal was whacked. So I think from a purely business sense, it made a lot of sense for Usal to cut that 50,000 acres. Made a lot of sense for Hawthorne to cut Usal and get some cash out of it and let somebody else worry out how to get timber out of it into the future. So I think from their perspective, it made sense. And again, RFFI had the cash, and we had the Bank of America's backing, which gave a lot of credibility in the money world. So it just right time, right place for them and us. From that point on, we needed to start talking about the management companies. We needed to start talking about protection of the resource, and really where most of our efforts went in. And I think one of the greatest legacies of RFFI was able to secure the conservation easement. I don't think that gets talked about enough. The fact that 50,000 acres is held in one piece into perpetuity is huge. Someday California is going to reach Usal, and we see urbanization of forests in Sonoma County, Santa Cruz County, Mendocino County. Someday that urbanization is going to move north, whether it's conversion for high-end wine grapes or cannabis or something. It seems like the trees are always in the way. People don't want to just appreciate the trees for what they are. We got to get them out of the way and do something else with forests. Build houses, put in vineyards, put in whatever. So I think the fact that we've been able to lock that 50,000 acres into a solid piece, that's a legacy that I'm quite proud of. And people like Don Kemp and Art and Tom Huckman, they worked so hard on getting that legacy, that conservation easement in place. Again, that was a lot of intense discussions. What are we giving up? What are we going to keep? How many options, economic options, do we want to keep open? Those were more tedious monthly discussions, but at the end of the day, I think we got something that we can be proud of, and which to me is another product, a very valuable product for ecological reasons and economic reasons. Again, it got real, and there are a lot of management decisions that I think made people uncomfortable. Again, to give credibility to the bank, we took a management company that a lot of local folks weren't comfortable with. And even though the Campbell Management Group are very competent, extremely competent managers, they wanted to manage within the context of what they were comfortable with. And it wasn't a model that RFFI was comfortable with. It worked. It got us started. It got us moving forward. It got us understanding what it meant to run a business of that size and scope. And I think a lot of us realized that it was going to be a short-term arrangement, but it was a necessary arrangement to get started. And it made some of the original founders of RFFI uncomfortable. They just didn't want to have their names associated with that management style, which was fine. They didn't leave. Some of these board members took on a different role, which they were still involved, and it was a role that they were comfortable with, and I think all of us respected. The Campbell Group, as I said, got us started and helped me understand just how big of a project we had taken on, whether it's managing roads, doing restoration, and actually that's where Campbell really helped us. I mean, like on all those Indian Creek restoration projects, the millions of dollars we got, Prop 1 monies and stuff, we wouldn't have got that money if it wasn't for Campbell, because he had a dedicated employee who was dedicated to making sure that we got those restoration dollars. So there was a lot of good that Campbell gave on behalf of RFFI. They didn't give it to us; we paid for them. But at the same time, it was hard. It wasn't a good fix. The timber management side wasn't a good fix. They were expensive. A lot of times, the economics of that expense was driving the cut, and it just made a lot of us uncomfortable. So, at the right time, it was time to move on. But initially, it served a lot of purposes for both of us. So using a conservation easement, when RFFI opted to go that route, there was a lot of pushback from other large timber owners in our vicinity. Even though Well, one of the arguments was the fact that we were a nonprofit organization, that we were able to secure public monies to put that conservation easement in. And I think there was some legitimacy in the argument that perhaps the playing field wasn't all that level. Nonetheless, the option to put on a conservation easement is totally voluntary, and there probably are ways that some of these large corporate, they're family ownership. If we look at the ownership now in Mendocino and Humboldt County, they're very wealthy families, but it's still family ownership. Maybe they had the wherewithal to secure other sources of funds or manipulate some of their own private money to lessen the tax burden or whatnot. But nonetheless, there's probably some legitimacy in that RFFI was able to use public monies. But at the same time, I think there was some fear. They were so they were so aggressive in their approach that there had to be more than that. There had to be more just than principle. And perhaps they looked at it as a trend that would somehow force them to put on a conservation easement and limit some of their future options on how they could parcelize their land. But it did cost RFFI time and money because of those letters. There was a bunch of letters. There was a lot of political pressure put on the legislature on allowing RFFI to use the money that was available at the time. It was just more of the turmoil that went on. RFFI trying to break the mold, trying to do something different, trying to look at forest land under different scenarios. And I think that was part of the game. Since then, other nonprofits have moved in. Again, RFFI being the first. We were cutting new ground, and I think you need to expect to get some pushback when you're taking risks and you're trying something new. I think the reason RFFI was successful, we didn't rely on the internet. We didn't rely on social media. We didn't rely on people making up lies to promote some kind of warped agenda. I think we didn't have social media in 1997 when we started this, and I think there's so many influences on society as a whole today. I'm not sure the RFFI model can be used to address the ills facing our society in this country. There's some really warped, from my point of view, there are some really warped agendas that are living on dysfunction and promoting dysfunction for reasons I don't fully understand. RFFI never focused on dysfunction. We focused on disagreement. We focused on working through those disagreements, but we didn't have outside influences trying to disrupt what we were trying to do. And there are a lot of outside influences, foreign and domestic, that are trying to disrupt what this country is really all about. I don't have an answer for you. I think we're doing it. I think a working forest is producing products, and again, those products are not limited to wood. I think with the restoration work that we've done, we're trying to grow fish. With the tens of thousands of dollars we put into road repair, we are working to ensure that our activities on the forests are not degrading water quality. Certainly the community has become very involved in not only the workings of RFFI, but the community knows that RFFI exists and that Usal exists. The other day when I was in Fort Bragg, somebody who didn't know who I was, but talked about the recent fire on Usal and oh yeah, it's on that RFFI ground, which is great. where the board is trying to get more community engagement now on the property, and allowing the community to feel like they're part of something. There's a lot of layers to that onion of what a working community forest is, and it's not a park, but at the same time, I think it gives people a feeling like they could be a part of something really big. I think that's, for me, that's what it means. It's not part of Portland. It's not part of Atlanta. It's part of Mendocino County, and people recognize it as part of Mendocino County. I think that's a big deal. They mean it. Art Harwood says that a lot. That was his mantra. That's just those 3 E's are just the basis of really third party forest certification. The whole Forest Stewardship Council is based on those 3 E's. The whole 3-legged stool approach. To me, it's just a way to do business. You don't have an economy if you don't have an environment. You don't have an environment if you don't have social equity. They just go hand in hand. And I think when we look at examples where, past corporate examples where the economy E was a capital E, and the other 2 E's, I don't even know if they were small case. I don't even know if they existed in some times. But there was an imbalance where the resources paid the price. There was overexploitation of the economic resources, and ultimately social equity went away when people lost their jobs, and the forests are still trying, the environment of the forests are still trying to recover because of past focus on capital E economics. So I really think it's just the only way to do business, and it's part of who I am. And in the past, when I did some, I didn't mention it, but when I did consulting on forest certification, the more you get into it, the more you think about and you ponder about the 3 E's as it relates to resource management, natural resource management. There's really no other way to move forward, I don't think. So you asked me a question about the use of insecticides or herbicides. Well, fortunately, in the redwood type, insecticides are really a non-issue. Redwoods are so resistant to insect diseases. If we were dealing with pine or Douglas fir, it might be a different story. But we don't talk about insecticide use in redwood types, and even if we did, RFFI would probably choose things like bacillus or other biological controls. They still are technically insecticides, but not synthetic, more biological controls. Herbicides in Mendocino County, that's a big deal. It's been a big deal because of the way it's been used in the past. I think rightly so. It should be a big deal. I think, again, getting back to corporate absentee ownership, when they used to do foliar sprays and you'd see workers coming out of the woods covered in the dye that was used to mark. I mean, there was lots of issues of worker health and safety. There were lots of water quality issues with these materials being found in surface waters. The problem is, or at least my perspective and I'm not a big promoter of use of herbicides, but my perspective and where I'm coming from is, since World War II, these forests have been placed on a trajectory, on a path, because of past management. Old growth forests were converted to something else. That conversion released a lot of trees, tan oak and madrone, that were held in check when the forest was in an old growth condition. Tan oak and madrone are incredibly important ecological components and associates of a redwood forest. But even in my own research, studying the structure of old growth forests, maybe you had 4 or 5 majestic tan oaks per acre that were producing acorns, that had split bark, that could harbor bats, that had trunk hollows where various species of rodents could store acorns and the like. Old growth forests are hot, are cool, and they're moist. All of a sudden, we've got a forest that's hot. It's hotter. It's drier, and it's being dominated by these trees that were held in check. These species that were held in check, particularly tan oak and madrone. And in my own research, and this was collaborated with work that was done by Hammond, Jensen, and Walling in 1969 when they cruised what is now Redwood National Park, an old-growth redwood forest, depending on how close you are to a riparian area, you're looking at somewhere between 35 and 50 trees per acre. They're big trees. They're huge trees, like this tree to my right here. I mean, they take up a lot of space, but there's only 35 or 40 or 45 per acre. Today, you go out and you look at these forests, there's hundreds of trees per acre. They're all small. Case in point, when we did the Biochar project out on Usal, Robert Ballard and I went out on 2.5 acres. We cut 800 trees. We didn't put it. When we were done, I looked back over my shoulder. I thought, damn, we should have cut twice as many. You couldn't tell we made a dent. 800 trees out of 2 acres, 2.5 acres. So these forests have been put on this trajectory of super overcrowded, overstocked, stunted trees. With climate trends being what they are, with the loss of fog days, which has been documented now for the past couple decades, these forests are getting hotter and drier. There's a lot of straws in the glass. There are thousands of trees per acre. Things like Douglas fir, stunted Douglas fir, yeah, you can go through there with a chainsaw or loppers and knock them down and kill those trees. Those 800 trees that Robert and I cut, we didn't kill those trees. We just pruned them. We took the sprouts. I went back a year later. Every one of those trees we cut, it's sprouting. They're still extracting water. They're still extracting nutrients from the soil. They're still robbing redwood trees of their abilities to grow to their full potential. To be blunt, I want to kill those trees. I want to redirect that energy from those thousands of trees per acre that have been put on this trajectory because of past management decisions. I want to put the forest on a new trajectory. I want to grow robust redwood trees. I want to grow robust Douglas fir. I want to have robust tan oaks at 4 or 5 per acre. I think there are some plots like that plot that we took the biochar. For me, I think we need to start over. We need to remove all those trees. We need to kill those stumps, and we need to get it on a new trajectory. And even though herbicides are a sensitive subject, I don't know how else to do that unless otherwise we just maintain the status quo, which is a forest that will be increasingly stressed because of climate change and is stagnant. I'm not, again, on Usal, there's 31,000 acres out of the 50,000 that's dominated by tan oak because of these past decisions. I'm not saying doing all 31,000 acres, but I think there are some areas that we could effectively manage to put on a new trajectory that would restore a redwood forest to being dominated by redwoods. But recognizing that it's very sensitive, recognizing that I am not a fan of foliar applications. I think that a hack and squirt treatment is a judicious way to use a chemical. I think it minimizes worker exposure. It minimizes environmental hazards. And for my way of thinking, it gives me the results I want. I want to remove trees per acre permanently so that I make space and I redirect energy on that acre to those trees that I want to restore. To continue on that line of thought, I respect people's convictions. I don't belittle those convictions of people who are opposed and fearful of herbicides. I accept that. And I accept my position too of saying, okay, you can't go out there and hit 31,000 acres, Greg. That's that moderation thing. But I think when you're dealing with passionate people, and one of the things that we wrestle with in those monthly meetings is, when do our personal convictions get in the way of what we're trying to accomplish? And that's where I think, and that's when those tough discussions have to take place. And I would never ask anybody to abandon those convictions, but at the same time, how do we put suggestions on the table that help us move towards what we all want? And again, that's not an easy thing. It's something easy to talk about. It's something harder to get to reach. But I think that's the strength of RFFI. I mean, we can have those discussions, and still at the end of the day respect everybody's point of view. My research on black bears and second growth forests was actually started. Emanuel Fritz, who had the Wonder Plot here in Mendocino County at the headwaters of the Big River, that I was fortunate enough to remeasure in 2005 and carry on his legacy that he started back in the 20s, actually wrote a note back in the late 1920s about, and Emanuel Fritz, Mr. Redwood out of UC Berkeley, he was actually the first one to recognize the possible value of second growth redwoods. At the time, it was all old growth, and obviously nobody in the 20s thought that all the old growth would disappear by the late 1980s, because mechanization had not achieved that level of efficiency. Anyway, he first put a note in that black bears during the spring months were feeding on redwood trees. And that was it, just a passing note. He had a similar passing note about tree squirrels feeding on the tops of young growth redwood trees. And then in the 1950s, Fred Glover came along and actually again recorded that black bears were feeding on redwood trees up in Humboldt County. And at the time, it was working with the Department of Fish and Game, now Fish and Wildlife, State Fish and Wildlife, and we're trying to manage black bears for minimizing damage and using recreational hunting, targeted recreational hunting in particular watersheds, to remove bears. No bears, no damage. Well, when I came on the scene up in Del Norte County in the mid-1980s, black bears again were being targeted, not so much only through hunting, but through depredation permits and using wildlife services, USDA wildlife services, the federal trapper. And it hit the fan. I mean, people were up in arms over bears being killed for the sake of protecting second growth redwood. Again, it was in the context of the turmoil that was going on at the time over timber management at all levels. So the Indian tribes were upset about killing bears. Local folks were upset about killing bears. Houndsmen were upset about killing bears. Recreational hunters. Nobody liked it. And at the time, a judge had came out and looked at the Department of Fish and Game's bear strategy and declared that it was a prescription for extinction. Strong words, but the state of California had no bear management plan. They were just killing bears. So I took it upon myself to be the first one to quantify the damage that was being done, to articulate exactly what the bears were doing. So I had several research plots. Was able to determine the size of cohorts that the bears were selecting. Was able to tie it back to pre-commercial or commercial thinning that the timber companies were doing. All this was on, at the time, Arco Redwood and Simpson lands, and it was predictable. I actually was able to develop a model that 2 years after pre-commercial or commercial thinning, when you get the release of the trees, the bears would move in and start feeding on the trees in the months of May into the first 2 weeks of June. It's a time of year when the bears are hungry. It's a time of year where there aren't a lot of other food resources for them. The bears are basically opportunistic animals. They were using the skid trails in the roads, feeding heavily along those pathways. And what I was trying to do, I was trying to develop a model so that the timber companies could change their silvicultural practices and eliminate the behavior, try and change the behavior of the bears that were simply responding to an available food source. By looking at the density of the trees, what they were thinning them to, suggesting that, well, maybe if they left a few more trees, one, they could absorb some damage, but two, might not get the same level of release on those second growth redwood trees and wouldn't elicit that behavior of the bears feeding on the trees. It was a different generation of foresters back then. They just didn't like the idea about doing something for the bears. And I was working with the state of Washington. There was a gentleman up there that him and I were corresponding, and they had actually developed a wood pellet impregnated with sugar, fructose, I believe. And I was trying, and I've still, to the end of my career, I was trying to get the state of California to allow me to import some of these sugarized wood pellets to put out as an alternative feed source for these bears during those months. I was working with the Hoopa tribe. They were trying to get it done. We couldn't get permission to bring in those wood pellets to distract the bears. It's like, okay, if you guys don't want to change your silvicultural practices, let's try and put out a distraction out there, put out hog feeders, fill them with these wood pellets. And the state of Washington had shown that it had a positive effect. It didn't eliminate bears feeding on trees, but at the same time, it lessened the problem. You know, I ran into the same, I mean, this is a quote, "Why should I feed those damn bears?" It's like, well, okay. So what ended up happening is they lost their depredation permits. They haven't changed their practices, and the bears are still feeding on trees, and people are still complaining about it. But nobody was serious about wanting to come up with an alternative food source and see if we could put a distraction out there for the bears. Since then, bears have moved into 10 Mile here in Mendocino County, and there's damage going on there. There's still an opportunity to do some behavioral manipulation of those bears and see if we can get them to feed on something else other than trees. It's hard to change. But again, it's frustrating because it seems like and all I wanted to do was test it. You know, if it didn't work, it didn't work. Mm-hmm. The tribe up in Hoopa said the same thing. It's like, yeah, we'll buy some pellets and we'll give it a try. You know, we'll give it an honest effort. Mm-hmm. And if we can, it's only 6 weeks out of the year, and if we can distract those bears for 6 weeks and they don't kill trees, perfect. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's hard for people to envision that Usal could someday be threatened by urbanization. Probably was a time when people thought that about Santa Cruz or Sonoma County. But you know, if you go to Sonoma County, you go to West County out there, and you look at those forests. Those are urbanized forests, and urbanization brings lots of challenges for a forest. It brings roads, it brings driveways. All of those roads, all of those driveways are bleeding sediments into streams. It brings exotic plants. It brings pampas grass. It brings English ivy. It brings French broom. All of those plants can still be purchased in retail outlets. It's infuriating. It brings house cats, feral cats that feed on native wildlife. It brings noise. It brings lights. It brings disruption to what would be otherwise a dark, isolated environment. So, and it brings people. It brings people with their noise and their garbage and everything else. So I think, and it brings a greater threat of wildland fire because of changes that go on. So, even though it looks like a forest, it's not a forest anymore. It's a neighborhood. And it brings a lot of challenges on how we manage a neighborhood in a forested environment. And again, there's no boundaries per se in California what can be exploited or developed. So it may be hard to believe that that Usal could someday be developed or around, so that Laytonville or Leggett could burst into a metropolitan area. But I'm not talking about a new Stockton in Leggett, but I'm talking about 40-acre parcels that each one has a driveway, and each one has a house, and each one has a footprint. That's urbanization. Each one is extracting water. Each one is clearing, areas to put in fruit trees, whatever. That can and will happen in California in time. And again, there's the double side of that coin is that as our urban centers, and if you look at the models, you look at the planning models of California, you look at the urban centers along Highway 101, along the I-5 corridor, the Bay Area, Sacramento, Redding, Stockton, these urban centers are getting more dense, they're growing, going out to 2015, and so these urban centers, you're going to hear this huge sucking sound as they're going to say, feed me, water me, more food, more water, more energy. What are people in those urban centers going to want to do on weekends? They're going to want to get out of that rat race. They're going to want to get out to wildlands. They're going to get, we're seeing that with Yosemite. We're seeing that with our national parks. They're being loved to death. The North Coast on the weekends, there's more and more people coming up here. People are going to want to break away from that intensity of those urban centers. In places like Usal, places like Leggett, you can buy a piece of paradise and you can get away from that. And as people have more liquidity, and there's a lot of rich people in the Bay Area that can afford to come up here and buy, they're going to do that because they need to for their own sanity. So I think the fact that we can have a chunk of ground like Usal, and I wish some of the other larger landowners would do the same thing, but they're leaving that option open. They're leaving options open to parcelize some of those forest lands, and I don't see any reason why that won't happen, given the population trends that are predicted for California. So you asked me about biochar and RFFI's involvement with it. Again, RFFI did it, right? We built a biochar machine. We had it specially built for us. We went out and cut trees and dried those trees and chipped those trees and put them through the biochar machine and created biochar. On a very, very small scale, nonetheless, but we did it. Humboldt State University helped us evaluate the product that we ultimately secured, produced. Unfortunately, it was a pilot project, and it was treated like a pilot project. So after we did our pilot project, it just kind of fizzled out. At the time, we had no problem selling the product we were making as a soil amendment. I think probably, most of the biochar work in the literature talks about its value in tropical forests and tropical soils. It makes a lot of sense. Tropical soils are so depleted of nutrients because of all the rain they get. It just literally gets washed away. I think for the North Coast, it probably has limited value in terms of a soil amendment, in actually adding something to the soil. But I think where it does have some value is carbon is very good at retaining water. And I think that's where the value for our customers who were buying it and adding it to their soil mixes at the time, I think recognize that it can retain water and be an aspect of conserving water for the crops they were growing. Does biochar have utility? Sure. It's charcoal. The Egyptians made charcoal. People in this country, many of the oaks that were cut in the late 1800s and the early 1900s in California were turned into charcoal. I think but again, it's all scope and scale. Certainly what RFFI did was a pilot project. It demonstrated that our wood products could be converted into a biochar, but in order to be an effective strategy to manage woods in California, we would need a facility of enormous size, and maybe someday it'll happen. I think where it could really pay off, and I've said this publicly, There's a lot of other sources of wood that probably need to be incorporated into just the forest wood that could be used. But if you think of the orchards and the vineyards every year that grow tons and tons and tons of wood that are pruned and then simply burned, I think there's an opportunity for somebody like RFFI to collaborate with the wine industry. Think about most vineyards you can drive to. It's easy. But again, to get some momentum and to get people thinking about creating biochar, working with the vineyard industry, getting them involved, and then supplementing that wood with forest wood, which is a lot harder to get to. Our biochar, where we selected our wood for our biochar site, it was a 2-hour drive from anywhere. And again, there's the logistics of extracting wood out of the forest is a lot harder than extracting wood out of a vineyard or out of an orchard. But I think looking towards the wine industry to maybe get some capital to start building a facility in concert with the timber industry, looking at creating other wood products from these orchard and vineyard products, whether it's pellets, whether it's biochar. I think there could be a nexus there where one could help the other. So I think that perhaps for biochar to be taken seriously, it has to be taken seriously. You're either going to commit to it and build an enterprise around the concept, or otherwise it's just going to be another good idea that nearly never gets the play it deserves. But I think we grow a lot of wood in Northern California and lots of different sources of wood. I think a lot of people can play in that game. RFFI was 20 years of my life. When I retired from the board, it was 20 years. And in that 20 years, RFFI absorbed me. I don't know how else to put it. I mean, it just became part of the fabric of who I am. The frustrations, the elation, the highs and lows. I mean, it was a part of my adult life for 20 years, and the people I worked with, the experiences I gained, the product that we got in Usal, all of those are things that I'm very proud of to have been a part of, and I really can't separate who I am from RFFI because it was such a big part of my life for so long. And I'm a very fortunate individual to have had the opportunity to work on the project and work with the people that I did to get that project. So I had a good ride, and I don't regret a minute of it.